Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Doreen Greenwald. She is National Executive Vice President of the National Treasury Employees Union. Ms. Greenwald was just named to that post in January. Previously, she led the response to the COVID-19 pandemic for NTEU's largest bargaining unit. She also worked for 35 years at the IRS, including more than 20 as a revenue officer. Before we begin our usual bit of housekeeping, we encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event is being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Doreen Greenwald, welcome to The Prescription.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And congratulations on becoming National Executive Vice President.
Thank you.
So as we get started, why don't we just take a minute for you to explain what the NTEU is and who it represents?
Okay, NTEU stands for the National Treasury Employees Union. It's a union based of members of federal agencies. We represent 34 different agencies. We started back in 1938. I actually was the chapter president before taking this post with chapter 1 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So it started back in the Midwest in the state of Wisconsin and grew going forward until it became the National Treasury Employees Union. So we're proudly representing federal employees across a wide variety of agencies and look forward to, bringing their ideas together and helping the federal government.
And since we'll be talking today mostly about the IRS, how many IRS employees do you represent?
Over 60,000.
Great. Okay. So, as I noted in the introduction, you played a lead role in the union's response to the pandemic. Give us a sense of how it affected Treasury and IRS workers and their ability to do their jobs.
I'll tell you that Treasury, as well as IRS, was impacted much like the nation. I don't think we ever anticipated having a pandemic we would have to deal with. And Treasury, as well as IRS, has for the last decade or so suffered from severe budget cuts and not having sufficient staffing. Well, this was really highlighted when the pandemic hit, because for the first time, IRS as an agency was really behind with a lot of its technology. And so the pandemic forced the agency to really move towards technology to be able to have employees continue working while being safe. And that was one of our key goals, is making sure that employees were safe in their work environment. And so early on in the pandemic, the IRS took great measures to get additional laptops and things of that nature so that employees could, for those who had portable work, be able to continue to work in the safety of their homes.
So I guess one of the issues with people working remotely at the service has to be security. Was there certain work that could be done at home and then other work that couldn't? Help us understand what people actually could do from home and what just couldn't get done.
Well, security is always a primary issue that IRS employees take at heart. They're very cautious about anything. So all of their systems are encrypted. All of their access is encrypted. So the work that could not come to homes is stuff that needed the equipment from the offices, that isn't portable. So like mail that came in that they'd have to open, or payments or things of that nature were all dealt with actually in the processing centers where those returns would be processed, paper returns, that kind of thing. Types of work that was able to easily work from home is like call sites. So people who would call in for getting questions answered, they could connect using their computers and answer questions that way. The IRS did already have a telework program in place. So for those people who had portable work that could do that work, many of those people were able to just expand and maximize their telework. phones became a new type of work that was done under the pandemic. Some of the funding that was given to the agency allowed them to go out and get equipment so people could resume and keep working from home to do the type of work that they normally would come into an office to do.
So there was a period of time at the beginning of the pandemic when the offices were just closed. And then my understanding is things reopened. What was the circumstances like there? Did people feel safe going back into the office? Were people concerned about the working conditions? What was that like?
You know, we met with the IRS pretty much on a daily basis when the pandemic first started. And as gradually they've worked to adapt to keep employees safe. I will give kudos to Commissioner Rettig, because early on in the pandemic, early March and into April, they made the tough decision to close down some of the offices to keep people safe. And then as more information became available and safety procedures could be put in place, they gradually reopened starting in April and then May for volunteers. And pretty much all of the non-portable work was back up and running in late June, early July of 2020. And so during that time, they instituted different policies such as making available masks for employees, social distancing, frequent hand washing, providing hand sanitizers and wipes. And NTU was an integral part in making sure that those things were available to employees. Employees were very nervous about returning to offices. They wanted to be safe. And I think we've been at the forefront of making sure that different procedures were in place to address those safety needs. Another part is the maximum telework. If you didn't need to go into the office to perform your work, your best safety measure was to work from home. And so IRS did expand telework as much as possible to keep people safe. And I think the numbers support that employees, thankfully, while lives were lost in this pandemic, I think it could have been far worse had maximum telework not been enabled as soon as possible.
So as you mentioned, one of the issues were paper returns and all that correspondence. And of course, we heard about the trailers and all the rest of it. From your perspective, from the perspective of the union, how serious is this backlog that the service is facing now?
It's a very serious backlog. I mean, I worked for the IRS for 35 years. I would say the backlog is probably something they've never seen before at these levels, but they've also never experienced a pandemic before. And I would also add that during the pandemic, IRS was critical in delivering the economic impact payments, the stimulus payments, as well as the child care credit payments that were issued. So on top of their regular work, and with an already reduced staff and shortage of funds and equipment, they delivered, and they delivered in a pandemic. So it's a tough time. I think this is going to be a rough filing season for them, but understand that the IRS employees are working their best to get through that and deliver for the American public.
So what are you hearing from your members? I was talking to a staffer the other day who said she's still working on 1040s from as far back as 2017. And she said that she has not even begun working on tax year 2021 returns. Is that typical, or is she something of an outlier?
Well, it depends on her role. I didn't follow who you spoke to, a staffer. It depends on the part of the agency. They are currently working 2020 returns. I mean, obviously, with the changes in the tax law during the pandemic, there have been amended returns filed, so it may not be unusual for them to be dealing with other work. I expect that during this last year, as there was a backlog beginning, taxpayers, when they can't get through to people to answer calls or to address their mail, they probably submitted multiple items. And so how much of that backlog is duplicate, we just don't know at this point until they work through it. I'm sure people filed returns, and then as laws changed, they went, oh, I should have put in for this credit or that credit, and filed an amended return. And amended returns are usually worked after current returns. So, they will get addressed in the appropriate time, and they're dealt with in a different area. So there's a lot of adjustment work that needs to be addressed. Meanwhile, there's a current filing season going on, so new work coming in as well.
So we've been talking about COVID, and I'm interested from your perspective, how much of the inventory, how much of the backlog is COVID, and how much of this is due to underlying problems with the agency that need to be addressed beyond COVID?
Well, I think a percentage of it is COVID. I mean, obviously, whenever you have a brief halt to the current day-to-day operations, that takes its toll. I would also say adding on the additional work of the economic stimulus payments and the child care payments added work that wasn't there before. So some of that is due to COVID. Some of the adjusted and amended returns are due to COVID and some of the benefits that people can take advantage of. But I would have to say that the underlying and the primary issue is the lack of resources and the lack of proper funding. The IRS found itself struggling before the pandemic. With the pandemic and the current economy, they struggle to hire as well. And so as they have an aging workforce and people retire, it's harder and harder to replace those folks, as well as they have a need. The current situation is creating more paperwork for them than they anticipated. So they have a need to hire more. And so it's kind of a perfect storm.
So this is an interesting issue, and I want to get into a little more detail about this question about IRS resources. So there seems to be a broad agreement that the IRS needs more resources, that this 10 years of budget cutting really did go too far. So I've got two questions for you. The first one is the magnitude of spending Congress is talking about hasn't yet passed, but is the magnitude of spending that Congress is talking about, is that enough to really address these issues?
Well, there's never enough, right? But I think it's a really good start and really important. Right now, the funding that they're talking about is sustained funding for a period of time. People think you just go out and hire people and they can start working at the Internal Revenue Service. It takes a while for new hires to be trained and actually able to perform the work that they've been hired for. And that can take anywhere from 6 months to 3 years to get somebody trained and actually doing the work of the IRS. And so it's important that the IRS have consistent and steady funding to support their mission. In addition, you have an aging workforce, so people who are planning to retire. Thankfully, there hasn't been a tsunami as has been predicted over the past several years. But as people age and with this pandemic, I assume you're going to see some more retirements. And it's going to be harder and harder to recruit people if the IRS doesn't have proper funding and equipment so that they can retain and attract new hires. So this is a really good start and it's really important. We've seen the devastation from the cuts over the past decade. That cannot continue for the IRS to continue to hit its mission.
So some critics have said that this is more than a money problem, that this is a management problem, it's an organizational problem, it's clearly a technology problem, which partially can be solved with perhaps with money. Do you agree with that? Is there a management problem at the IRS too, besides just money? In other words, do they have a plan for spending the money if they get it?
Well, my understanding, they do have a plan. I mean, obviously, every part of the organization could benefit from an infusion of funds. There is a need for technology. There is a need to modernize. There is a need to build off of the successes of what they've experienced in the pandemic by expanding telework and making things more efficient. So I do believe there's a plan in place. I do think there needs to be a modernization and a recognition that to fill these positions that the IRS has, they need to be creative in doing so. Right now, as you can see, the job market's tough and it's hard to get new hires in any sector of the economy, let alone federal government. The government tends not to be able to offer the bonuses and things that the private sector can. So funding and having the right pay and benefits will go far in filling and backfilling some of these positions.
Let me ask you about staff morale. It's been a problem at the IRS for a long time. I have to say that anecdotally, in my conversations with IRS employees, it seems to be getting worse. From your perspective, what's the problem? Why is there this morale problem at the IRS?
Well, working for a taxing system, you're never really popular. And so, oftentimes there's a lot of political angst that is caused. Over the last 10 years, not only have there been budget cuts, but there's been some negative feedback about federal workers in general. I will tell you, IRS employees work day and night to deliver to the American public. They don't have the resources and they don't have the technology they need. They continue to do more and more without any assistance. And it takes, this whole pandemic is exhausting to those who are having to deal with their family and work through this pandemic and deliver all of the things that are being asked of them. If somebody retires or somebody leaves or God forbid has died from this pandemic, there's limited resources to pick up and carry on those duties. And so I think what you're seeing for morale purposes is there's not a strong appreciation for the work that they do. They're delivering day in and day out. I mean, look at the economic impact payments as well as the child care payments. They are doing things during an unprecedented time on top of their regular work, but little is really acknowledged about the great job that they're doing day in and day out. So it's hard for them to come in every day and take on new things.
So one issue that people have raised to me is that some workers are slowing down their return processing so they can turn seasonal jobs into full-time work. Is that a problem? Is that an issue?
Absolutely not. Nobody's slowing down any work. What has happened is technology hasn't caught up with the processing of returns. A lot of these amended returns that needed to be processed are done manually. And so they have to key in all of these things. They have to analyze them. They have to do manual adjustments and submit them. That's what's bogging down the system. It's not about a slowing of work. It's about bringing the current system up to modern technology and being able to do things more electronically, more scanning, more capability of digitizing things. And the IRS is working on doing that, but they haven't had the funding to deliver all of those things.
The way it's been described to me is this process of handling a paper return seems like it's something out of the, I don't know, the mid 20th century. It's just so people manually, mechanically using literally a red pen to find errors, and then it has to go to somebody else who has to key it in. I mean, this just seems like an incredibly technologically backward system. From the perspective of employees, what's it like?
The system they know. It's been that way, as you said, since the mid 20th century. Since the 1960s, I think some of the computer programs were developed and they're still operating, probably by Band-Aid, but they're operating. And the IRS is working very hard to try and update a lot of those systems and bring it into the 21st century. But that takes money, it takes time, it needs to be tested. And the American public is at different levels of technology as well. I think you've seen some of that in the news lately, where some people are concerned about the technology IRS is considering. Others aren't there themselves. If you only offer online technology to people, there's a lot of taxpayers who don't have Wi-Fi, who don't have a home computer, who don't trust computer systems and are worried about being hacked and things of that nature. So they aren't comfortable filing anything but a paper return. And until you address that, you have to be able to deliver on all levels of technology to meet the taxpaying public's needs.
But we have now, I guess, well over 90% of returns are being filed electronically. The experience that people had with the electronic, the impact payments as a result of COVID seem to have gotten more people sort of used to the idea of filing electronically. Do we have are we in a place now where now that the vast majority of people are filing electronically, that we could do some things to still make it easier for people to get their refunds? I mean, we've heard stories, for example, about people getting, notices, getting CP80 notices about the IRS never received their return, even though they filed a return. what can we do to make this work better, even for people who are filing electronically?
Well, I think the IRS put out statements about this filing season and the backlog. I think what is happening this year, and I think this year is unique, is because of the amount of paper that needed to be filed because of the pandemic as a result of some of the amended returns that I talked about. Until those are processed, it holds up some of the current filings because some of the things are based on the prior year's filing. And so you're going to see some of that where a notice may go out while the paperwork is pending to be processed on one section. The advice the IRS has put out for this year is if you can file electronically, you should do so. And for the most part, if people have simple returns and are filing electronically, that system is working and people are getting their refunds. So as the IRS works through this backlog, I think you're going to see fiscal year 23's filing season improve going forward. But without the proper funding and employees to do all of that, the IRS is going to continue to struggle.
So you were a revenue officer. One of the issues that comes up a lot is could the service use machine learning to smooth the process of audits, give it a head start in a sense at identifying problems. Is that something that you think could work?
So I was a revenue officer. So that meant I went out and actually collected the taxes that were not paid and the returns that were not filed. Don't audit or didn't audit. I do think the service IRS is looking for different measures to assist taxpayers in filing returns. It's a compliance-based system, voluntary compliance. And quite frankly, revenue agents as well as revenue officers, a good portion of their work is educating taxpayers and helping them file in the future. The majority of taxpayers want to file the right return and do it correctly. And the simpler we can make that for them, the better, right? But understand that the IRS does not write the tax code. That's done by Congress. And so any simplification there is going to be driven by Congress and not the IRS. Many of the functions that they do to try to keep it simple. So yeah, if there's things that could be done technology-based, so as you enter things, I think you're seeing more and more technology. You can just enter your W-2, you can download that information into the system so you're not making keystroke errors. A lot of those things are simple math errors that are caught year in after year to help taxpayers to not make those kind of mistakes.
So there's always a tension between technology and humans. And one of those tensions is, the technology sometimes can replace workers. So when you think about what the IRS is doing, what it's thinking about doing in terms of implementing new technology, do you have any fear that it's going to replace workers, or do you think it can complement the human workforce?
I think if it's done correctly, it will complement the human workforce. Because of the complexity of the tax code, I think you're always going to need to have a level of human interaction to have that discussion. There's going to be things that require that back and forth conversation to look at things, to assist with the tax code. So I look at it as a complement. I look at it as using the resources to be more efficient and to be more successful in making sure that people have the right tools available to them so they can comply voluntarily.
So Commissioner Reddick's been talking about a staff surge that would help process returns, including reassigning some staff to address the backlog. What does the NTU think about those initiatives?
I think it's unfortunate that the commissioner has had to go to a surge. I mean, basically what he's looking at is reassigning workers from one area to do work in another area. Understand those workers are needed in the area they currently work. So, I mean, you're basically moving people around to try and deal with where there's currently a backlog, and likely will end up creating a backlog somewhere else. The problem stays in the fact that they don't have the staffing and funding necessary. That's the problem. So while this may be a temporary measure to try and put some extra resources in one area, there are no extra resources at the Internal Revenue Service. They have inadequate staff to do all of the work that is necessary for the American people. And so without an influx in budget and funding and hiring and getting those people trained and up and running, it's a struggle.
So in other words, it sounds like what you're saying is that to the degree the service is going to shift workers from one job to processing, that's going to mean that the job those workers were originally doing isn't going to get done.
That's correct.
Yeah. Let me ask you about Austin. The service was planning on shutting its processing center in Austin. NTU and some of its allies on the Hill intervened. Why was it such a bad idea from your point of view?
Well, I think we're talking about it today, the backlog.
Right.
What we've seen, I mean, this was a plan that the IRS created almost a decade ago to start reducing the number of submission processing sites, with the understanding that as more returns are filed electronically, there wouldn't be such a need to process paper. Great idea. But here we are today in 2022, and we are at over 90% of people filing electronic returns. There is still a significant amount of paper that needs to be processed. And by reducing the number of sites that can process that paper, it's causing backlogs and delays. And that is no way to service the American people. So by intervening and having Austin not continue on its plan to shut down, I think the IRS is better positioned to continue to process those returns. It's unfortunate that the biggest processing center, Fresno, was allowed to close in 2021. They, up until the last day, were processing returns and could have probably helped deal with some of this backlog had they been able to stop that. I'm thankful that Austin is being delayed and not being closed as the decision the IRS said recently, that they're not going to go forward with that.
So is it your understanding that this is a reprieve, but that the center will still be closed once they get past the backlog, or is the center going to remain open?
As far as I know, it plans to remain open. I don't know that down the road, 10 years from now, depending on where electronic filing is and technology, I don't know what the future holds, but as of now, we believe it's stopped.
Doreen, we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you a very broad question, and that is, help put the agency's problems in perspective. Do you worry about the future of voluntary tax compliance if the IRS can't get a handle on taxpayer services?
About voluntary compliance for all of the parts of the IRS that are not functioning right now. They are not living up to the enforcement levels they should, because they're lacking staffing there, both in audits and collections. I worry about taxpayer service because taxpayers want to file. If you want to have voluntary compliance, you need to make it as easy as possible and be able to answer people's questions. It's very frustrating if you're trying to do your return and you can't get a hold of somebody, or you can't get an answer to a question, or you send in a letter and you don't hear back. All of those pieces of the puzzle must function appropriately for the system to work. And without the proper funding and hiring, that system is on the verge of collapse. And so Congress really needs to take action and make sure that there's proper funding for the IRS this year and years going forward.
Okay, well, thank you. We are out of time. Thanks so much for taking time to talk to us. It's going to be an interesting filing season for both for IRS employees and for us taxpayers. So thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you.